Welcome back to the Naughty Corner. For our first proper installment in breaking down the IPCA report, we're going to look at one of the most fundamental aspects of reporting anything: accuracy. This will broadly be broken into three sections. The first, we'll be looking at some very conspicuous omissions, then inconsistencies and outright falsehoods, if they exist, and finally, we'll question if there was any reporting bias. I do have an opinion on these things, but for the most part I'll try and lay that aside, tell you just what the report itself says in its own words, and let you decide for yourself. To start with, the report has a few omissions that I feel most people aren't aware of. As I mentioned last episode, a lot of complaints were received regarding this protest, 1,905 in total, and the report clarifies that almost all of these are about police conduct, with less than 160 of these complaints asking why the protest wasn't stopped earlier. In a section titled Purpose and Scope of the Review, the report states, "The law allows us, the IPCA, to take a proportionate response to each complaint, depending upon the circumstances. Many of the 84 complaints we received from those directly affected bore common characteristics. Consequently, we elected to take no further action on the majority of the specific matters they raised." In other words, the Complaints Authority decided to take no further action on the majority of specific instances brought to them. That sounds quite shocking to me, like a fancy way of saying they chose not to do their job. I personally received injuries during the protest and filed a complaint. They told me it would be addressed in this report, but this glib dismissal is the closest it gets to being mentioned, and I can't help but wonder how many others have had the same experience or similar. Most of the complaints received were for the same 28 instances, and in paragraph 112 we read that in 8 of those instances, the offended party communicated directly with the authority, and these instances will be investigated separately and the outcomes communicated privately to the offended party, therefore not included in this report. This includes 2 instances of an officer putting their full weight on a teenager's head, punching an elderly man in the face who was attempting to protect another protester, eye gouging a man, grabbing a man seated at a bollard and pulling him to the ground by his neck, fracturing a woman's sternum while she was standing in front of a police skirmish line, placing a man in a headlock and dragging him along the ground by his neck and ear, striking a woman in the face with a shield, breaking several of her teeth, and using a fire extinguisher on protesters. To reiterate, none of these instances will be included in the ultimate cumulative and public opinion forming conclusions of this report. Plus, for those of you counting at home, yes, there was 9 instances of violence in that list, but for some reason, planking on the heads of 2 separate adolescents only counts as 1. In addition to this, paragraph 120 then goes on to state that a further 11 incidents would also be excluded from the report, including the following: kicked the complainant and attempted to choke him, repeatedly hammer punched the complainant in the eye, smashed the windows of the complainant's van while it was being driven in a convoy, resulting in the occupants, including a child, being showered with glass, kicked the complainant in the back while he was sitting on the ground, grabbed him by the shoulders and then kneed and shoved him across the footpath, arrested the complainant's 16-year-old son and subsequently issued him with a warning without lawful grounds. The complainant was sworn at and threatened with the use of pepper spray when she attempted to collect him, dragged the complainant through a police line, struck him about the face, threw him to the ground and kicked him in the back. Consequently, the complainant lost his glasses and sustained an eye injury requiring specialist treatment, dragged the complainant through a police line, repeatedly punching and kicked him, and then pepper sprayed him while the complainant was in restraints, and 3 separate instances of firing sponge rounds into complainants who were innocent bystanders. The report also explains that many other high-profile complaints won't be included for the following reasons: they were not fully or accurately depicted in photographs or footage originally supplied to us, were not sufficiently serious, and or involved police tactics we intended to address in this report. This includes the globally infamous instance of a naked girl being dragged by her hair, a protester who appeared to have been deliberately tripped over by an officer as she was being escorted to an area where protesters were being processed following their arrest, a protester who allegedly was punched while on their hands and knees, a police officers pushing, dragging, restraining or plucking protesters from the crowd, the force used by police officers when clearing Parliament grounds and the surrounding streets, and police officers using fire hoses on and throwing bricks at protesters. Now, is it just me, or is the amount of questionable conduct that isn't being included in the police conduct report really starting to stack up? If you exclude all these instances, then yeah, you'd certainly hope the police end up smelling like roses by the end of the assessment, right? Now on to falsehoods and inconsistencies. We'll start with a couple of things that aren't outright false, but they do come across as a bit misleading. In paragraph 116, under the section titled Common Misunderstandings and Misconceptions, the report states that they're satisfied the police did not use tear gas. There's a little annotation, however, and if you follow that down to the footnotes, it points out that they did use large pepper spray canisters, which people may have mistaken as tear gas. Pepper spray, which is commonly considered to be more painful and unpleasant than tear gas. In a similar vein, the same paragraph says police did not use knuckle duster gloves. They used hatch reactor gloves. If you Google the term, you'll see they're gloves designed for disturbance control, with hardened polymer knuckles. So they're being purely semantic, because people called them knuckle duster gloves colloquially. These instances might have been a little bit disingenuous, but then in the same paragraph the report shifts to being outright inconsistent. They say that the police deployed only serving members of the New Zealand Police Force during the protest. But hold on, if you go back to paragraph 50 of the executive summary, it says non-graduated recruits were also deployed. Further to this, in paragraph 714, it states, due to a lack of available staff, some recruits who were close to graduating had been assigned cordon roles at the Parliament in late February 2022 to prevent protesters from breaching the police lines and breaching Parliament buildings. The local controller said that in making this decision, he was conscious of the attack on the United States Capitol on the 6th of January 2021 and said that he did not want the beehive to be breached on his watch. Not only does this show inconsistencies in the report, it's an interesting illumination that the local controller would reference the Jan 6th protests in the States in such a manner, another protest of enormous size involving one of the most heavily armed demographics in the world, and yet the only fatalities that day were protesters. In fact, if you've been following the still unfolding revelations regarding January 6th, it's increasingly starting to look like an instance of political theatre. As a side note, returning to the report, it says the recruits that were interviewed by the IPCA had quite enjoyed their cordon duties and engaged positively with members of the public during that time. Paragraph 727 details how one recruit who had been either training or on cordon duty for more than 24 hours was then asked to drive other recruits back to the police college at about 8 AM the next morning. The recruit tried to refuse due to tiredness, but was told no one else could do it. While driving out of Parliament grounds, he had a minor collision with a cyclist. Moving on from the use of recruits, paragraph 125 states that they obtained and reviewed CCTV footage from Wellington City Council and Parliament, and paragraph 129 expands on this, saying that the Parliamentary Services and Wellington City Council did not retain all CCTV footage from their respective cameras in and around Parliament grounds. That's fine, but perhaps a little misleading, as we'll soon learn the following. Wellington Police District Custody Unit footage for the 10th of February was not available due to a system upgrade that occurred, and Lower Hutt Police Station cell block footage for the 10th of February had been overwritten. Parliamentary Services did not retain any CCTV footage other than some from the 2nd of March 2022, as the rest had been overwritten. The exact same thing happened with the Wellington City Council CCTV. Some from the 2nd of March was retained on police request, but the rest was overwritten. The custody footage from Wellington District Central Police Station was not available for consideration by the authorities team, as it was destroyed when a scheduled system rebuild done by an external contractor occurred between the 16th of February and 28th of March 2022. It's a disturbing issue in itself that so much critical footage seems to have been scrubbed rather than retained when its significant future value would have been obvious. It also calls into question how accurate can the report be with so much evidence missing. It would require a lot of leaning upon testimony, which is something we'll touch on soon. Perhaps the most concerning falsehood comes under the section detailing the police attempts to clear Parliament grounds on the 10th of February. In paragraph 279 it says, "Many of the officers within Wellington District with whom we spoke and some from elsewhere were firmly of the view that the decision to conduct a police operation on the 10th of February had resulted from strong political pressure. Some inferred that the pressure crossed the line and intruded on police operational independence. The frontline staff we interviewed were overwhelmingly of the view that it was obvious to them from early on in the operation, although not necessarily beforehand, that it would not succeed, and were repeatedly told that the direction to proceed with the operation would not have been given the go-ahead unless police had succumbed to political pressure." In paragraph 280, the authors of the report write, "The authority would be most concerned if there had been inappropriate political interference with police decision-making. It is a fundamental constitutional principle that police must remain free to make independent operational decisions, that they cannot be subject to political direction on operational matters, and that they are answerable only to the law and the courts in respect to those matters. We have therefore carefully questioned all of those involved as to what occurred." The problem with this is that obtained via an OIA, there are records of many heads of government interacting with the police extensively via WhatsApp, but the report omits this fact entirely and claims that any interactions were minimal. If we take the most charitable interpretation, they weren't aware of the WhatsApp interactions, but that just means that the information gathering for this report was poorly executed. Which segues neatly into our final section for this episode. Was the information gathering for the report also poorly executed due to reporting bias? I'll make it quick, fire some figures at you, and you can draw your own conclusions. Paragraph 123 reveals that of the people interviewed in creating the report, 62 out of 377 were protesters. That means only 16% of those interviewed were on one side of this issue, and the rest were on the other. Sounds really balanced. Of the photos used in the report, 3 were from a source sympathetic to the protesters. All 3 from a single one-page website put together by a couple of portrait and commercial photographers, boasting 5 embedded videos and virtually nothing else. By contrast, 26 photos were drawn from sources that have expressed opposition to the protesters, including 7 from the New Zealand police themselves, the very subjects of the investigation. Lastly, one rule of report writing is that you're not supposed to use coloured language. That is, non-neutral, non-factual wording that might sway the reader's opinion one way or the other. There's a lot of examples of this in the report, but I'll give you just one. In paragraph 36 it states, "All police staff had the best intentions." Does IPCA also stand for interpreting psychic currents accurately? How could you possibly know any of the police staff's internal intentions, let alone all of them? Anyway, that's it for now. Join us next time as we look into the events of February 10th, the match that sparked a fire.